has just scored 303 not out against England, and I think we'll be declaring by now. So.
Apologies for keeping you. Is this on? It's a real pleasure to be here in Cal with so many familiar faces in the room. And it's also a pleasure that I've been invited to talk to my father about his new book. In June, we have a sort of family WhatsApp chain because we're so scattered in many places. And in June, my father disappeared to the wilds of Bhutan, from where he proceeded to send us photo after photo of him walking in some foggy path. But what was actually happening in Bhutan in those 2 weeks or 3 weeks? Was it 3 weeks?
12 days.
12 days was that for 18 hours a day, my father non-stop wrote a 400 plus page book, which is a measure of both his ferocious work ethic and also the rarefied air of Bhutan, I think. Anyway, the result of this book is of that effort is his new book, An Era of Darkness, which I'm sure many of you have seen, maybe even read already, which is a pretty comprehensive rebuke of the centuries of British rule in India. And we're going to talk a little bit about the book and about some of the ideas spawned by the book and around the book. And I thought I would just begin by asking you why you felt that initially, I mean, as you know, the genesis of the book was his famous viral video from the Oxford Union speech. And as you pointed out yourself, the reason it went viral was because it was needed. Now I wanted you to tell us why you think it was needed and what the urgency of this story about history is right now.
Well, I mean, there was both a circumstance. First of all, let me say also that I'm thrilled you're all here. Many of you are old friends. Some of you are new faces. It's great to be back in Calcutta, where I spent my high school years, have great memories, and particularly to be grilled by my son Kanishk. Kanishk and Ishan and I did an event at the New York Literary Festival when the three of us talked collectively as a family about writing. But this is the first time he's actually sort of grilling me on a book of mine. It's a thrilling experience. Thanks, Kanishk, for doing this. And good to see you all. Now, coming back to the specific issue that he asked, the circumstance was Oxford. I mean, the Oxford Union speech, and then it went viral, and my publisher, David Davidar, called me and said, look, you've got to write a book on this. And I said, come on, everyone knows this already. To which he said, no, they don't, because if they did, it wouldn't have gone viral, which I suppose made sense. So I said, all right, let me try and do something. And as I wrote it, what was interesting was people kept coming up to me at all sorts of places, airports, planes, hotels, any public spaces you could imagine, as well as receptions, dinners, and all sorts of things, perfect strangers saying how much the speech meant to them. And I think what's striking about that was that what I had taken for granted as something that every Indian school child should have known had actually either not been taught or not been remembered. Now, if you ask why is it necessary, I would argue that just as each of us wants to have a sense of who our father and mother were, what their past was, what the grandparents were like, and so on, similarly as a society and as a civilization, we need to be conscious of our own past, of where we've come from, what's happened to us, at least the relatively recent past in our very old history. And as I say to some of the young people to say, but this is all 70 years ago, why bother now? My answer is, if you don't know where you've come from, how will you appreciate where you're going?
So, in terms of where we've come from, one of the arguments you make in the book, again, this is, you've said yourself that it's not necessarily for an academic audience.
No, it's not. It's really written for the kind of people in this room, just thinking, ordinary folks who are interested in serious ideas.
But one of the remarkable things, and it's a fairly fat book, considering you wrote it in 12 days.
Well, no, really 12 days was half the book, in the sense that it was the first draft.
But there's a remarkable amount of detail there. And, we don't, so often when you hear apologists for empire, And to be fair, I think they've been shrinking in number in the last 50 years or so, but they're still around. And I think you talk about Niall Ferguson a lot, who's probably the most famous, well-known current apologist for empire. But there's a sense that, they don't talk too much about the suppression of industry, and they present empire as an agent of change, as an agent of innovation, and even now the argument about the railroads persist. But you take that on head on, so maybe you can present that case, the case against the railroad.
Well, I mean, the whole argument is, oh, look at the British, they left us the railways. Well, the railways were actually a gigantic colonial scam. Why were the railways conceived to be built? Because it was a way of penetrating the Indian hinterland in order to extract resources from India to be taken by rail to the ports and shipped off to England. And of course, you could move labor and so on to extract these resources more easily once you had the railway lines. On top of that, the railway lines were built at Indian taxpayers' expense for British profit. So for about 25 years, from the 1850s to the 1870s, the single most profitable investment available to any Englishman on the London Stock Exchange was Indian Railways, because they gave a guaranteed rate of interest. Whether or not the railways made any money, and of course in the initial years they didn't, they got a guaranteed rate of interest paid for by the Indian taxpayer. It was called at the time private profit at public risk, except the private profit was all British and the public risk was all Indian. On top of that, these railways were built with no regard for money, because obviously the money was being paid by Indians. So each mile of Indian railway cost 9 times more than the equivalent mile being built at the same time in either America, Australia or Canada. That was 9 times more, because there they had to look at their profit and loss, and here it didn't matter because the Indian taxpayer was paying. On top of that, of course, it was run on a very racist basis. Right up to the First World War, they essentially ensured that every position except the most menial had to be filled only by Europeans. So they had even ticket collectors and station masters in the bigger stations were all Europeans. Until the First World War, when for other reasons there was a worldwide shortage of European males, then they had to look around. They said, let's find the most European of the Indians, and they grabbed the Anglo-Indians, which explains their identification with the railway industry. Then, of course, there were the fact that, of course, with these rail lines being used, Indians did start getting on them as passengers. Even though the lines were not laid for in terms of popular travel demand, it was all in terms of British economic interests. So when they attached these third-class wagons with these terrible wooden slat benches which passed for seats for Indians, they charged the Indian passengers the highest passenger rates in the world, while charging British companies the lowest freight rates in the world to ship their freight on the same railways. So when we say the railways are a great boon, in fact it's only after independence that we took this British institution and turned it around to suit Indian purposes. All new rail lines were actually to meet passenger demand for travel. All additional trains were driven by passenger considerations, and indeed we now have the lowest passenger rates in the world, whereas freight rates have gone up to such an uneconomic level that many companies are shipping their goods by lorry and truck on our congested highways and destroying our environment. So, I mean, that's not a good thing for India, but at least it shows that Indian interests only came into play on the railways after independence.
In the same breath that people refer to the railways as one of the great legacies of colonialism, they also refer to the rule of law, the legal system, courts. I think you also talk about how those were self-serving and deployed hypocritically. You can go into detail about that if you want.
Well, I mean, that is something that's often flung at me, because, I mean, Dr. Manmohan Singh, when he went to Oxford in 2005, made a speech in which he praised the British for having left rule of law in India and so on. And the truth is that he was being a polite guest to his hosts, but the truth is that rule of law in India was extremely unevenly applied, and applied essentially again to uphold British interests. The fact is that all justice was administered with great attention to the skin color of the defendant. So in the entire 200-year history of British rule in India, only 3 times were Englishmen convicted and executed for murdering Indians, all appalling cases. Whereas hundreds and thousands of Indians were murdered and Englishmen were let off with light fines or at most 3 or 4 days in jail on one extenuating circumstance after the other. One of the most common deaths, hundreds of deaths occurred with Englishmen kicking their native servants to death in fits of rage. And the explanation given in the courts was, you see, all Indians have enlarged spleens because of their habit of getting malaria. And therefore, it's not the fault of the kicker, it's because the spleen is so enlarged that it ruptured and he died of a ruptured spleen. And there was even odes, in fact, one particular British colonel wrote a book saying that the question of whether guilt should be established in the middle of the night if the fellow, if the Englishman is sleeping and the pankha wala stops moving the fan and the Englishman gets up and kicks him to death, the only question that should be asked is, did he stop to put his boots on? I'm not joking. This is all in the book, quote unquote. And the Punch magazine wrote an entire poem, an ode to the stout British boot. That was the message of. So this is the kind of racial justice. No Indian judge was ever allowed to sit in judgment on an English person. When I say ever, not for the first 100-odd years anyway, or more of British rule of law, such as it was. And at the same time, when one relatively non-racist viceroy, Lord Ripon, tried to pass the Ilbert bill that would have allowed Indian judges to try defendants irrespective of colour, the Englishmen in India rose up in protest. The bill was scrapped and Ripon was sacked as viceroy and sent back to England. So there simply was no interest in even-handed justice. And that's why when you praise Britain for rule of law, you have to acknowledge that it was actually applied essentially again in the interests of the English in India, the British Empire, and not that of the Indian subjects. So again, the notion of even standards of justice only really came in to be applied in India after independence.
While you don't ask for reparations, you do ask for atonement, which is different. You've talked about how you would like a British Prime Minister or a member of the royal family to come to Jallianwala Bagh on the 100th anniversary of the massacre and sink to their knees and apologize for...
Well, let me explain that. Reparations became an issue only because the Oxford Union had put that into their topic. I never was a big reparations person, but I was speaking on that topic, so I said, give us a symbolic £1 a year for 200 years. But anybody who's administered a finance ministry will tell you that's impossible to do. So it wouldn't have happened. In any case, if you really compute the damages, they would be so unrealistically, it would be impossible for anyone to pay them. An Indian journalist actually, after my Oxford speech, did an extensive calculation of what the British should pay in terms of reparations to India, and he came up with the astronomical figure of £3 trillion sterling, which is more than the entire GDP of Britain. So I don't think it would have made any sense to ask for that. So if any credible figure is not payable, and any payable figure is not credible, then why even go for reparations? My answer is, you can't compute the value of those 35 million lives I've talked about. You can't compute the value of all the damage and death and destruction done. So what you should do instead, it seems to me, is to ask for atonement in two different ways. And the first, as Kanishk said, is inspired by what other leaders have done in other situations. Willy Brandt, the Social Democratic Chancellor of Germany, went to Warsaw, Poland, and sank to his knees in the Warsaw ghetto to beg forgiveness from the Polish people for what the Nazis had done to the Jews of Poland. Don't forget that Willy Brandt, as a social democrat, was totally innocent of any of these crimes of the Nazis. In fact, him and other social democrats were persecuted by the Nazis. But as the head of the German government, he felt a moral obligation to convey Germany's apology to the people of their victims. Second, more recent example from this year, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, apologizing in the Canadian Parliament to India for turning away the ship, the Komagata Maru, 100 years earlier, with Indians on board fleeing British rule, who mostly then met untimely deaths, in many cases at the hands of the British and some at sea. And though the Canadians didn't actually kill these people by pushing the ship away, they essentially sentenced them to death, and that was essentially what Trudeau was apologizing for.
Revelation for me, at least, and for all of us. I wonder why all this isn't put in our ICSE books and history books. A little bit of this should go in. So so much of it is unknown to people who didn't study history beyond the 10th standard and all that. So maybe you should go in there. And of course, a great privilege to have both of you here. He himself has written this book, Swimmer, Under the Stars.
Among the Stars.
And also has, he used to call himself a nerd. So I don't see the nerd in him anymore. It's there somewhere. you said that. So thank you very much. It's great. I'd like to call Miss Ranu Bangar from Shri Cement and Mr. Prashant Bangar.